ReZero Volume 2 Review. This volume marks the beginning of Arc 2, the Tumultuous Week. Arc 1 was short, so Arc 2 is still very introductory and it weaves a lot of exposition into the dialogue, from small things like how stoves work in this world, to more major things like the magic system. It also introduces a lot of important characters such as Ram, Rem, Roswaal and Beatrice. Once again, I'll divide this review into sections, so first I'll talk about the characters, and then I'll talk about what I liked and disliked about the book at the end. Let's start once again with our protagonist, Subaru. Subaru's dialogue is a lot more cringy in this volume. This isn't really a surprise to the reader, but volume 1 was much more hectic. Subaru was going places, trying not to get killed. Here, the volume is a lot more based around dialogue, so Subaru has a lot more opportunities to make a fool of himself. For example, upon meeting Ram and Rem for the first time, he says that they're both going to star in his fantasies, which is a bit of a joke, obviously, I think. But it's also very cringy, like why would you say this to people you just met? Imagine being in another world and acting like this with people you don't know. Also, the whole first meeting with Roswaal gave me a lot of secondhand embarrassment. At the beginning of the book, the narrator says that Subaru did not want to see a blade anytime soon, and he does have his wish granted because in this volume he dies 4 times and none of them involve a physical blade. We get some new insight into Subaru's powers or lack thereof. He is aligned with the dark element but has very little talent for actual magic, so he will never be a powerful magic user like Roswaal, for example. I think this really matches up with the character well, first because he has no talent, as usual, and second because being of the dark element is a sort of a debuffer, and a debuffer build isn't really something for a solo player, it's more something for someone who plays in a party, and once again Subaru always beats his challenges through the help of other people. In the first volume there's a mention of his parents, and here he thinks about his father in a monologue and later gets compared to his mother by the narrator. I think this is very wholesome, especially if you read a certain volume in the future, but upon rereading I think it's useful because usually isekai protagonists completely forget about their past life and I think that's very unrealistic, so I think it's cool that Subaru still thinks about his parents even after being transported into this new world. One of Subaru's biggest frustration in the previous volume was the fact that Emilia forgot about their first encounter and the fact that she saved him. Here his frustrations are much bigger because each death loop takes days at a time and the bonds and memories that he created with these people are completely forgotten. It's at this point in the story that we really start to see the mental toll that Return by Death takes on Subaru. Not everything is bad though, as Subaru discovers that he has at least the particular quirk of being able to quickly discover the correct door to Beatrice's archive, so for a dude with no noteworthy skills besides sewing, that's pretty impressive. The relationship is very funny, she's very condescending and rude towards him, but he doesn't really take her seriously and even talks back. Emilia at one point notes that they get along well, which is something that neither of them would like to admit. Their relationship is more of a bickering brother and sister sort of relationship. During these loops, Subaru uses Emilia and Beatrice as sort of emotional anchors. Usually after dying, he always goes into Beatrice's archive. This is for 2 reasons. The first, Beatrice is one of the only characters that remembers him, as she met him before the reset cutoff point, and the second one is that she's always very rude towards him, and I think that's sort of soothing in a weird way, because her behavior towards him never changes, unlike Ram and Rem, for example, who always start out treating him as a guest and very unfamiliar. The reasons he relies on Emilia are very obvious. First of all, he likes her. Second of all, she's the only character that's unconditionally kind towards him every single time. At one point the narrator even says that Emilia is Subaru's oasis in this new world. At the end of the book we see that Subaru is very selfless and has a lot of that heroic element I talked about in the previous video. In the first volume everything he did was for Emilia and he was always killed by some external cause. Here he actually commits suicide in order to save Ram, a character that literally killed him before and doesn't like him very much. So we see how far Subaru is willing to go in order to do the thing that he thinks is right. Now, let's go into the twin maids Ram and Rem. Once again, these volumes can be quite unsafe for work, so keep that in mind when reading this in public. Let's start with Rum. Rum is great. I love Rum. When the anime first came out, the community seemed to like Emilia and Ram a lot, but no one really gave much attention to Rum, which I thought was a shame, even though I get that story-wise she's very overshadowed by the other two. I think Rum is one of the funniest characters in the series. Rum has the perfect level of sass. If the sassiness scales goes from like a 1 in Emilia, who's an angel and kind to everybody, to let's say a 10 in Priscilla, a character from a future volume, who overshoots it a little bit, is just way too much, Rum is like a 7. She's just perfect, so entertaining to watch. Unlike Rem, who's very guarded around Subaru and very polite, Rum quickly decides that he's a dork, so she'll treat him like such. She calls him Beast, Barbarian. At one point she calls herself an animal trainer when taking care of him. There's even a scene where he lets go of some laundry and she throws it into the trash, saying that she was gripped by psychological distaste. The verbal abuse she comes up with is just great. Despite her sharp tongue, she does have a soft side to her, teaching Subaru how to read, for example, even if she didn't admit it was out of kindness. She's the perfect character to offset Subaru's cringy dialogue that gets a bit out of hand in this arc. Rum says that honesty is one of her selling points, and I completely agree with that. She's sharp, blunt, and even a bit arrogant sometimes, but deep down she has a good heart. Next is the other twin, Rem. Rem is the most complex character in Volume 2. In Volume 1, every character was clearly an ally or a villain, with Romanfeld being morally grey but never actually antagonistic towards Subaru. Here, Rem can be either an ally or a villain, depending on the behavior and actions that Subaru takes throughout the few days of the loop. The first thing that jumps out when we get to know her is that despite the twins being very similar in appearance, they're very different in personality, with Rum being very confident and Rem being a bit insecure, and Rum being always very blunt and Rem being very polite even if she doesn't like Subaru. Rem is better at everything apparently, yet she idolizes her sister, at one point even saying "what is wrong with me being the same as sister," when Subaru tries to get some individuality out of her. She's the first character to identify that Subaru has the smell of the witch, and so when he tries to do something suspicious, such as watch the mansion from afar or try to go to Emilia's room at night, she kills him. Despite killing Subaru 2 times, she still has a caring side towards him, which can be seen in some interactions throughout the book. Unlike Elsa, who's pure evil, or Emilia, who's always good, she must be convinced by Subaru that despite him having the smell of the witch, he's not actually a bad person, so she's not doing anything bad in her mind, she's just doing the right thing, which is eliminating a threat. Next, the bad boy himself, Roswaal. Roswaal is a mysterious character. He's this rich, wizard, eccentric guy that dresses like a clown and elongates words for no apparent reason. While there's clearly a lot going on with this character, he isn't very present in this volume. He's more of a mysterious mastermind overlooking the events. He has some funny scenes, such as when he's first introduced and later that funny bat scene he has with Subaru, but we can always see that he's holding back and there's a lot of information he's not giving. Throughout the whole volume, he seems to be mostly observing and planning. Planning what? I guess we'll only know in future volumes. In this volume, we learn that Emilia is in fact a big deal. She's a royal candidate, and this is also the first volume where Subaru calls Emilia Emilia-tan. Regardless of all the royal candidate pressure, she's still the kindest character towards Subaru, even acting a bit motherly at times. There's even a scene where she spoon feeds him, which I didn't remember and I found to be very funny. Just like in the first book though, we see that she has her own set of problems. She thinks that Subaru giving her the looks is a joke when it's very clear that he likes her, and she gets very self-conscious when Subaru mentions that she also doesn't have the royal education or that her silver hair is pretty, two of the things she's more insecure about. We still don't know much about her at this point in the story, but I think it's very interesting that she's a pillar of Subaru's emotional stability, as without her he wouldn't handle all the debts and the verbal abuse thrown at him. Next up is Beatrice. Beatrice has also a very sharp tongue and is always very disinterested in whatever Subaru's doing, always pushing him away, but for some reason he always comes back. I like the way she treats him though. The thing about Subaru is that he acts overly friendly with everybody he meets, and while for some characters that works very well, for example Reinhardt, some people are just bound to not vibe with Subaru at first. Even in real life, if we're being honest as readers, Subaru can be a bit annoying. Still, there's clearly a connection between Beatrice and Subaru. They both align with the dark element. Subaru can apparently discover her hidden passage without much trouble, and they both care more for each other than they care to admit. There's one moment in the archive where, despite her sharp words, she notices that Subaru's hands are shaking and that he's afraid, and she only tells him to leave after his hands stop shaking. And later in the volume she even makes a pact with him, and we later discover in future volumes just how significant it is for her to make a pact with Subaru. Just like Emilia, we don't know much about Beatrice at this point, but this is not her moment to shine. She will shine in a later arc. Now, onto my general notes. Things I liked about this volume. I like that every interaction is always slightly different in every loop. This makes sense as Subaru is actually living with these people, and sometimes even a difference in facial expression can give people a different opinion of you. He's actually living in a mansion and not, playing a visual novel where you can just click the same dialogue options and there's no variance there. Also, Ram is observant and knows in the later loops when Subaru is pretending that he doesn't know how to do the work. I think this makes a lot of sense, seeing as Subaru clearly does not have the finesse to fool anybody, and Ram is very perceptive. While this volume has more time loops than the previous one, with Subaru dying 4 times versus 3 in the previous volume, the pace seems a lot slower, which in my opinion is a good thing. This is mainly because there are very few characters and the volume is located almost exclusively inside Roswaal's mansion. This allows for more care and more time to be given to Subaru's interaction with each of the different characters. We discover that Subaru cannot tell anyone about Return by Death because every time he tries, a misty dark hand of darkness just grabs his heart and squeezes it. I think it's very good that they address this early on, as it always annoys me so much when characters in fiction withhold information that would otherwise be very useful. I can't help but think that if it were me, I would have just spilled the beans a long time ago. I like the Red and Blue Demon story. I think it's cool when stories have stories. It makes the world feel more alive, and I also think it's a nice detail that Subaru tells stories of his own world. Finally, I love the little tease at the end of the book where a shadowy figure tells that she cannot meet Subaru yet, so we pretty much get confirmation that Subaru's Return by Death power comes from the Witch of Envy herself. Now, for my criticisms of Volume 2, the first one is that the villagers are barely mentioned. The book effectively only has 7 characters, and I'm counting with Puck, and none of the villagers are even mentioned by name. I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing in isolation, but obviously having read Volume 3 and knowing how relevant the village is for the whole mystery, I think it's a bit jarring that they barely talk about the village. They only say that Subaru met a bunch of kids that liked him, that he was bit by a dog, and that the village is near the mansion, which, is in fact the relevant information, but I would have liked to have like a few more pages at the village itself. Upon rereading, I also think that Ram is way too impulsive and kills Subaru way too quickly. I know that he is very suspicious, and I know that he smells of the witch, which she hates and has a lot of trauma with, but I don't think that she would kill a guest, much less Emilia's savior, so quickly without at least consulting her sister or even Lord Roswaal himself. Looking back on it, I think that the way she just decides to kill Subaru so quickly is a bit silly, and this is one of those things that only works because this is a time travel story and her mistakes can just be erased from history, literally. I think that if she wasn't so absolutely amazing from this point of the story forwards, a lot of people of the community would have a hard time forgiving her, myself included. Overall, Volume 2 is nice and it's very fun meeting these characters again for the first time. If I had to give my MVP as a sort of a joke, I would give it to Ram because her dialogue is just the most entertaining. I love the verbal beatdowns she gives to Subaru, but if you give it to Beatrice or Ram or whoever, I can also understand. We're just looking for different things, I guess, different opinions. So yeah, this was my review of Volume 2, and see you in the next review for Volume 3.